We're losing the ridge. Where's the sniper? The voice exploded through the radio, sharp with urgency, cutting across the cold mountain air. Static crackled. Another transmission followed almost immediately. Hold your position. Reinforcements are 10 minutes out. 10 minutes. Up on the rocky ridgeline overlooking the valley, a lone figure lay behind a rifle, steady and unmoving while the chaos around her seemed determined to pull everything apart. Dust drifted across the slope. The afternoon sun hung low over the Afghan mountains, casting long shadows across the terrain. Below, dozens of service members waited anxiously, watching the narrow pass that led toward their position. If the ridge fell, the route would be exposed. If the route was exposed, the entire operation could unravel. Yet one rifle continued to scan the horizon with calm precision. The woman behind it barely seemed to notice the panic flowing through the radio network. Her breathing remained slow, controlled, focused. She adjusted her scope by a fraction of an inch, studying distant movement through the glass. The calls kept coming. Status update. Do we still have eyes on the northern approach? Can anybody confirm the ridge is secure? For several seconds, nobody answered. Then a quiet voice finally broke through the noise. The ridge is secure. There was no drama in her tone. No attempt to sound heroic. Just a simple statement of fact. The operations officer at headquarters paused. Around him, people exchanged uncertain looks. He glanced down at the roster on his desk. The name attached to that radio call surprised him. Sarah Mitchell, the sniper. The same sniper some members of the unit had spent the last week laughing about. The same sniper they had dismissed with smirks and sarcastic comments. The same sniper they had described as just a girl. The irony would have been amusing if the situation had not been so serious. Another radio call arrived. Sarah, confirm. Are you alone up there? A brief silence followed. Then came her reply. Affirmative. The room went quiet. Several officers stopped what they were doing. One of them slowly removed his headset and stared toward the giant digital map displayed across the operations center wall. Alone, on the ridge, holding one of the most important positions in the entire operation. Outside, the wind swept across the mountains, carrying fine dust through the afternoon sunlight. Sarah adjusted her position behind the rifle and continued watching the valley below. There was no fear on her face. No anger. No frustration. Only focus. The kind of focus earned through years of discipline. Years of training. Years of being underestimated. 18 hours earlier, nobody had expected her to become the person standing between success and failure. In fact, most of the men who now depended on her had barely taken her seriously when she first arrived at the forward operating base. Some had laughed. Some had rolled their eyes. One of them had even said the words out loud. She's just a girl. At the time, nobody imagined those 4 words would come back to haunt them before the next sunrise. The forward operating base sat between 2 ridgelines in a stretch of desert that seemed endless under the afternoon sun. 18 hours earlier, there had been no tension in the air, no urgent radio traffic, and certainly no reason for anyone to believe that the quiet woman stepping off a transport truck would soon become the center of the mission. Sarah Mitchell climbed down carrying a hard rifle case in one hand and a duffel bag in the other. Dust swirled around her boots as she crossed the compound. She wore the same camouflage uniform as everyone else. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention. She did not walk with exaggerated confidence. She did not introduce herself loudly. She simply checked in, received her temporary assignment, and began preparing for the next day's operation. Across the yard, a group of soldiers stood outside the briefing building drinking coffee and escaping the heat beneath a canvas awning. Staff Sergeant Ryan Walker noticed her first. He watched as she carried her own equipment without assistance and headed toward the armory. Who is that? He asked. One of the younger soldiers glanced over. New sniper attachment, I think. Ryan raised an eyebrow. That is our sniper? A few heads turned. Sarah continued walking without looking in their direction. Maybe headquarters is running out of people, another soldier joked. Several men laughed. Ryan shook his head. This mission is heading into mountain territory. We need experience, not experiments. The comment drew more laughter. None of them knew much about her record. None of them asked. They saw a woman carrying a rifle case and immediately filled the blanks themselves. Sarah heard every word as she passed. She showed no reaction. At the armory, she signed for additional equipment, inspected her optics, and reviewed weather data for the surrounding elevations. The sergeant behind the counter noticed her attention to detail. "You planning for a long hike?" he asked. Sarah offered a small smile. "I am planning for changing conditions." The answer seemed simple, but she spent the next hour studying maps while others relaxed. As evening approached, soldiers gathered near the dining tent. Stories filled the air. Jokes traveled from table to table. Ryan eventually spotted Sarah sitting alone near the edge of the tent reviewing satellite images. "Still studying?" he called out. Sarah looked up calmly. "Just preparing." Ryan leaned back in his chair. "Preparation is good, but you cannot learn everything from paper." Several soldiers chuckled. Sarah nodded once. "That is true." The response caught Ryan off guard. There was no argument, no attempt to defend herself, just quiet agreement. Somehow that annoyed him more than if she had challenged him. Later that night, while most of the base settled into routine conversations, Sarah remained focused on the terrain surrounding the mission route. Certain details continued bothering her. A supply road that showed unusual activity. A ridgeline offering perfect observation of the valley below. Small things. Easy things to dismiss. Yet experience had taught her that important warnings rarely arrived with flashing lights. They appeared as small details that most people ignored. Sarah marked several locations on her map, closed her notebook, and stared toward the dark mountains in the distance. Something about tomorrow did not feel right. The next morning began. Before sunrise, a cold wind moved through the base as soldiers gathered outside the operations building carrying gear and steaming cups of coffee. The mountains beyond the perimeter looked dark and silent beneath a fading blanket of stars. Inside the briefing room, a large digital map illuminated the walls with pale blue light. Squad leaders reviewed assignments while support personnel checked communications equipment. Sarah Mitchell entered quietly and took a seat near the back. She placed a notebook on the table and listened. Captain Daniel Harper stepped to the front of the room and pointed toward a valley running between several ridgelines. "Our objective is simple," he said. "Move through the corridor, establish observation points, and maintain route security for the convoy scheduled to pass tomorrow morning." Heads nodded around the room. The plan appeared straightforward. Ryan Walker leaned back in his chair looking completely confident. He had completed dozens of similar missions and saw no reason this one would be different. As the briefing continued, Sarah studied the map projected on the wall. The same concerns from the previous evening remained. Several locations along the route seemed unusually exposed. More importantly, one ridgeline overlooked nearly every approach into the valley. Whoever controlled that elevation would have visibility for miles. Sarah waited until Captain Harper finished speaking. Then she raised her hand. The room grew quiet. "Sir," she said, "has anyone reviewed recent activity around Ridge 7? Harper glanced toward the map. "What specifically are you seeing?" Sarah stood and approached the screen. "The terrain offers observation over the entire corridor. If I were planning surveillance, that is where I would start. There are also several access routes leading into the area that are easy to miss from satellite imagery." Ryan exchanged amused looks with two soldiers sitting nearby. One of them smirked. Another quietly shook his head. Sarah continued, "I would recommend sending a reconnaissance team to verify the ridge before the main movement begins." Harper considered her suggestion. Before he could answer, Ryan spoke up. "With respect, sir, we have been operating in this region for months." Several soldiers looked toward him. "That ridge has never been a problem. We do not need to redesign the mission every time someone finds a mark on a map." A few chuckles moved through the room. Sarah remained silent. Harper folded his arms. "Anything else, Staff Sergeant Walker?" Ryan shrugged. "Just trying to keep us focused on real threats." More laughter followed. Sarah slowly returned to her seat. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply wrote something in her notebook and continued listening. Captain Harper eventually moved on to other details. Vehicle positions, radio frequencies, timing checkpoints. Yet Sarah noticed something interesting. Although Ryan's comments had earned laughter, several experienced soldiers had not joined in. They had watched quietly, thoughtfully, as if they were considering her warning more seriously than they wanted to admit. After the briefing ended, soldiers filed toward the exit. Ryan passed Sarah near the doorway. "You worry too much," he said with a grin. Sarah closed her notebook and stood. "Maybe." Ryan laughed and continued walking. Sarah watched him disappear into the crowd. Then she turned her attention toward the distant mountains visible through the window. The uneasy feeling had not gone away. If anything, it had grown stronger. The convoy departed shortly after sunrise. Engines hummed steadily as vehicles rolled out of the base and entered the winding valley corridor. The morning air was cool, but the heat was already beginning to build across the rocky landscape. Mountains rose on both sides like silent walls, their shadows stretching across the narrow route ahead. Ryan Walker led the movement from the front, confident and relaxed. He had repeated the mission plan so many times that it felt routine. To him, the operation was simply another assignment that would be completed before sunset. Several soldiers shared his attitude. The mood inside the convoy was light. Conversations drifted across the radio. Someone joked about the coffee back at base. Another soldier complained about missing a football game. Sarah Mitchell sat quietly near the rear security element, studying the terrain through binoculars whenever the convoy paused. While others talked, she watched. Every ridgeline, every draw, every approach. The farther they traveled, the less comfortable she became. Around mid-morning, the convoy reached a checkpoint where the valley narrowed dramatically. Captain Harper ordered a short halt while teams confirmed navigation markers. Sarah stepped away from the vehicle and scanned the surrounding slopes. A movement caught her attention. It was brief, so brief that another person might have dismissed it entirely. She adjusted her optics and looked again. Nothing. Yet something felt wrong. The silence was too complete. Even the birds that normally circled above the cliffs seemed absent. Sarah moved toward Captain Harper. "Sir, I recommend another look at Ridge 7 before we continue." Harper glanced toward the ridge. "You are still worried about that?" "Yes, sir." Before Harper could answer, Ryan approached. "We have already lost enough time." He pointed toward the route ahead. "Everything is clear. We cannot stop every mile because somebody has a feeling." Several nearby soldiers laughed quietly. Sarah remained calm. "It is not a feeling." Ryan folded his arms. "Then what is it?" Sarah looked back toward the ridge. "Patterns." Ryan smiled. "Patterns." The word sounded almost ridiculous when he repeated it. "You see patterns. I see a schedule we need to keep." Harper looked between them. The convoy had already been delayed. The mission timeline was becoming tighter. Finally, he nodded toward Ryan. "Continue movement." Ryan immediately turned and began issuing instructions. The convoy started rolling again. Sarah said nothing. She simply returned to her position and continued observing the terrain. An hour later, the valley grew even narrower. The ridges rose higher. Visibility became more limited. The easy confidence that had filled the convoy earlier began fading. Conversations on the radio became less frequent. Soldiers naturally paid closer attention to their surroundings. Sarah noticed it too. People were beginning to sense what she had sensed for hours. Not danger they could identify, just uncertainty, the kind that settled quietly into the back of a person's mind. As the convoy approached the next phase of the route, Sarah looked once more toward the distant ridgeline. The same uneasy feeling returned immediately. This time it was stronger than ever. Somewhere ahead, something was waiting. She could not prove it yet, but every instinct she had developed throughout her career was telling her the same thing. The mission was moving exactly where someone wanted it to go. The convoy continued deeper into the valley as the afternoon sun climbed overhead. What had once felt like open terrain now seemed confined. The mountains pressed closer on both sides, narrowing the route and limiting visibility beyond the next bend. Drivers focused on the road. Team leaders checked their radios. Even the casual conversations that had filled the morning were gone. Something had changed. Nobody said it aloud, but everyone could feel it. Captain Harper reviewed navigation updates, while Ryan Walker monitored the lead element. Everything appeared normal on paper. Every checkpoint had been reached on schedule. Every communication link remained active. Yet the atmosphere inside the convoy felt different. Sarah Mitchell sat quietly, watching the ridgelines pass by. Her binoculars moved slowly from one elevation to the next. Then she noticed something unusual. A reflection. Brief. Almost invisible. It disappeared before she could focus on it. She immediately reached for her radio. "Captain Harper, I recommend we halt and reassess the route." Harper answered after a short pause. "Reason?" Sarah kept scanning the ridge. "Multiple indicators. I cannot confirm details yet, but something is wrong." Ryan's voice entered the radio channel before Harper could respond. "We have been hearing that all day." Several soldiers exchanged glances. Sarah remained calm. "I understand." Ryan continued. We stop now, we lose momentum. We keep moving. Harper hesitated. The convoy slowed slightly as the road curved around a rocky outcrop. Then he made his decision. Continue movement. Sarah lowered the radio. She had done everything she could. Around her, the valley seemed unusually quiet. No wind. No birds. No distant vehicle noise. Just silence. The kind of silence that demanded attention. Several minutes later, radio traffic suddenly increased. Not because of an emergency, but because multiple teams began reporting unusual observations at nearly the same time. One squad noticed fresh tire tracks near an abandoned trail. Another reported recently disturbed rocks along a slope. A third observed signs that someone had passed through the area not long ago. None of the reports were alarming by themselves. Together, however, they formed a pattern. The exact kind of pattern Sarah had been worried about. Captain Harper listened carefully as the updates arrived. His expression changed. Ryan's confidence began fading. The reports kept coming, one after another. Questions replaced certainty. Assumptions disappeared. Suddenly the route that had seemed completely routine no longer felt routine at all. Harper ordered the convoy to reduce speed and increase observation. Soldiers immediately shifted their focus outward. Sarah studied the terrain again and noticed something else. High above the valley sat a ridgeline overlooking nearly every approach. Ridge 7. The same position she had warned about. The same position everyone had dismissed. She raised her binoculars and carefully examined the elevation. From that distance, she could not identify specific details, but she did not need to. The location itself told the story. Whoever occupied that ground would control the view for miles. Harper finally came over the radio. His voice was more serious than before. All units, maintain heightened awareness. Ryan looked toward the ridge and remained silent. For the first time since the mission began, he was no longer joking. And for the first time, he began wondering whether Sarah Mitchell had been right all along. Captain Harper ordered the convoy to halt near the base of a steep ridgeline as additional reports continued arriving from multiple teams. The atmosphere had changed completely. The easy confidence that had filled the morning was gone. Soldiers moved with greater urgency. Radios stayed active. Eyes remained fixed on the surrounding terrain. Ryan Walker stood beside a vehicle studying the map he had dismissed only hours earlier. For the first time, he seemed uncertain. Sarah Mitchell remained focused on Ridge 7. Through her optics, she continued examining every contour, every shadow, every possible observation point. The more she looked, the more convinced she became that the ridgeline mattered. Harper approached her position. "Tell me what you see." Sarah lowered her binoculars. "The terrain controls the entire valley." Harper nodded. "And if somebody wanted advance warning of every movement through this corridor, that is where they would be." Harper looked toward the ridge. The climb would be difficult. Loose rock covered much of the slope, and the elevation gain exceeded 600 feet. Establishing observation there would require time and effort. Yet the strategic value was obvious. Ryan joined them a moment later. His earlier confidence had disappeared beneath growing concern. "You think we should move people up there?" he asked. Sarah answered immediately. "Yes." Ryan looked at the mountain again. "That is a long climb." "It is. And if there is nothing there?" Sarah met his eyes calmly. "Then we confirm the route is secure." Ryan had no answer. Harper made his decision. "We establish observation on the ridge." Several soldiers immediately began preparing equipment. The operation shifted from routine movement to terrain control. Sarah started checking her gear. Extra water, communications, optics, ammunition. Everything had a place. Everything had a purpose. Ryan watched her work. Unlike many people he had served with, she never rushed. She never performed for an audience. Every movement seemed deliberate, measured, professional. "You really expected this," Ryan said quietly. Sarah continued adjusting her pack. "I expected possibilities." Ryan shook his head. "I should have listened yesterday." Sarah glanced up briefly. "Yesterday is gone." The simple answer lingered in his mind long after she walked away. An hour later, the observation team began climbing toward Ridge 7. The ascent was slow and demanding. The afternoon sun reflected off the rocks while gusts of wind swept across the slope. Below them, the convoy appeared increasingly small. Sarah led portions of the climb with steady determination. She never complained, never slowed, never asked for special treatment. As the team approached the upper elevation, Visibility expanded dramatically. The valley stretched for miles in both directions. Roads, trails, and ridgelines became visible all at once. The importance of the position was immediately obvious. Even Ryan recognized it. He stood silently studying the landscape. Sarah raised her binoculars and scanned the horizon again. This time she noticed something different. A detail. Small. Distant. Easy to miss. Her expression changed slightly. Not fear. Not surprise. Recognition. The same feeling she had carried since arriving at the base returned stronger than ever. The ridge was not simply important. It was the key to everything that had happened so far. Sarah adjusted the focus ring on her binoculars and examined the distant detail again. At first glance it looked insignificant. A cluster of rocks. A patch of shadow. Nothing more. But the longer she studied it, the clearer the pattern became. Someone had altered the natural shape of the ridgeline. Captain Harper stepped beside her. "What do you have?" Sarah handed him the binoculars and pointed toward a narrow section of terrain overlooking the valley. Harper studied the location for several seconds. His expression slowly hardened. Even from that distance, the position was too perfect to ignore. Whoever occupied it would have an uninterrupted view of the entire corridor below. Ryan Walker joined them and looked through the optics next. This time there were no jokes. No dismissive comments. No laughter. Only silence. The realization settled over him immediately. Sarah had identified the most important ground in the area before anyone else. Harper reached for his radio and requested updated reconnaissance information from headquarters. The response confirmed what Sarah had suspected. Recent satellite imagery showed signs of unusual activity throughout the region, but analysts had not connected the information to Ridge 7. Sarah had. The discovery changed everything. Orders began moving rapidly through the communication network. Observation teams repositioned. Convoy elements adjusted routes. Additional support assets were requested. What had started as a routine movement operation had become a mission focused on controlling the high ground before losing it. Hours passed as teams worked to secure the position. Wind swept across the ridge. Dust drifted through the air. Sarah remained behind her rifle, scanning every approach into the valley. She noticed subtle movements others missed. A distant reflection. A trail that appeared recently used. Changes in terrain that suggested recent activity. Each observation was reported calmly and precisely. Headquarters soon began relying on her updates more than anyone else's. Ryan noticed it first. Every important decision now seemed connected to information Sarah provided. Every adjustment improved situational awareness. Every recommendation she made proved valuable. The woman many soldiers had dismissed was quietly becoming the most trusted set of eyes on the mountain. As afternoon faded toward evening, Captain Harper received new instructions. Several teams would reposition lower on the slope while maintaining observation across the valley. The movement created a problem. The ridge still required continuous monitoring. If everyone descended at once, visibility would be lost. Harper studied the terrain map and frowned. "We need somebody to remain in Overwatch until the transition is complete." No one immediately volunteered. The responsibility was significant. The position would become isolated for a period of time. Ryan looked toward the valley below, then toward the descending teams. Before he could speak, Sarah calmly checked her rifle and adjusted her headset. "I will stay." Harper looked at her carefully. "You understand that means remaining here alone until the handoff is complete?" "Yes, sir." Ryan stared at her. "That could take hours." Sarah simply nodded. To her, the decision required no discussion. The mission came first. The ridge came first. The people depending on accurate observation came first. Harper finally gave a slow nod. "Very well." As the sun began sinking behind the mountains, soldiers started moving down the slope. One by one, figures disappeared into the fading light. Eventually, only Sarah remained at the highest point, alone with her rifle, alone with the radio, alone on the ridge she had warned everyone about from the very beginning. Darkness settled slowly across the mountains. The last traces of sunlight faded from the valley floor, while distant ridgelines became silhouettes against a deepening sky. Sarah Mitchell remained alone at the observation point. Her rifle rested beside her as she scanned the terrain through binoculars. The radio on her shoulder crackled every few minutes with status updates from teams moving below. Most of the convoy had successfully repositioned. Vehicles were reaching safer routes. Observation teams were establishing new checkpoints. The transition was working, yet Sarah refused to relax. Experience had taught her that the final stage of an operation often demanded the most attention. She checked the valley again, then the western slope, then the northern approaches. Every few minutes, she recorded observations and relayed them to headquarters. The information seemed small on its own. A dust trail, a vehicle moving miles away, a change in activity along a distant route. But together those details created a complete picture of the battlefield environment. Down below, Captain Harper listened carefully to every report. Operations personnel began organizing Sarah's updates onto digital maps. Patterns emerged. Routes were adjusted. Timelines improved. Decisions became easier because one person on a remote ridgeline refused to stop paying attention. Hours earlier, many soldiers had questioned why she was even part of the mission. Now an entire command network depended on her observations. Ryan Walker sat beside a communications vehicle reviewing the latest updates. Every report seemed to begin with the same words. Sarah confirms. Sarah observed. Sarah recommends. He stared at the map in front of him and remembered the jokes from the base. The comments in the briefing room. The confidence with which he had dismissed her concerns. The memory made him uncomfortable. Not because she had proven him wrong. Because she had never once tried to prove him wrong. She had simply done her job. A radio transmission interrupted his thoughts. Observation post. This is command. Confirm route visibility. Sarah's voice answered immediately. Calm. Clear. Professional. Visibility confirmed. All movement corridors remain observable from current position. Ryan listened in silence. Nearby soldiers listened too. Nobody interrupted. Nobody questioned her assessment. The respect that had once been absent now existed without anyone announcing it. It had been earned quietly, the way lasting respect usually is. Near midnight, headquarters received confirmation that all convoy elements had completed their movement safely. The operation that had seemed increasingly uncertain earlier in the day had succeeded. Multiple officers credited the outcome to information gathered from Ridge 7. Captain Harper finally contacted Sarah directly. Observation post. Mission objectives complete. You are cleared to return. A brief pause followed. Copy that, sir. The simple response carried no pride, no celebration, no demand for recognition. Sarah packed her equipment exactly as she always did. Methodically, carefully, professionally. As she prepared to leave, a helicopter crew arriving to support extraction received a summary of the mission. One pilot looked surprised. She stayed up there alone the entire time? The operations officer nodded. She did more than that. The pilot glanced toward the ridgeline visible beneath the moonlight. Who is she? For a moment nobody answered. Then Captain Harper looked toward the mountain and spoke quietly. The reason this mission stayed on track. And for the first time since arriving at the base, nobody in the room disagreed. The helicopter touched down just before dawn. Its rotors stirred dust across the landing zone as Sarah Mitchell stepped onto the base, carrying the same rifle case and pack she had carried the day before. Nothing about her appearance had changed. She looked tired from a long night on the mountain, but her expression remained calm. Around the operations center, officers were already reviewing reports from the mission. Maps covered the walls. Updated assessments filled computer screens. The conclusion appeared again and again throughout the documentation. Early observation from Ridge 7 had provided critical information. Continuous monitoring from the ridge had allowed commanders to make better decisions. Maintaining visibility over the valley had protected the mission timeline. Sarah walked past most of it without stopping. She turned in her equipment, completed her reports, and prepared to move on to her next assignment. To her, the mission was over. The work had been done. Recognition was never the objective. Meanwhile, Ryan Walker sat alone outside the briefing building holding a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He watched soldiers begin another day around the base. Some headed toward maintenance areas. Others prepared vehicles. The routine continued exactly as it always had. Yet Ryan could not stop replaying the previous 24 hours in his mind. He remembered the jokes. He remembered the laughter. He remembered dismissing Sarah in front of an entire room. Most of all, he remembered how many opportunities he had been given to listen. Eventually, he stood and walked across the compound. Sarah was loading gear into a transport vehicle when he approached. For a moment, he struggled to find the right words. Sarah noticed him and waited patiently. I owe you an apology, Ryan finally said. Sarah looked at him quietly. For what? The question surprised him. For not listening. For making assumptions. For all of it. Sarah considered his answer for several seconds. You were not the only one. Ryan shook his head. That does not excuse it. A faint smile appeared on her face. Not a proud smile. Not a victorious one. Just the expression of someone who understood that people learn at different speeds. Ryan looked toward the mountains visible beyond the base perimeter. You saw it before any of us did. Sarah followed his gaze. The signs were there. Why did you keep pushing when nobody listened? Sarah closed the latch on her equipment case. Because the mission mattered. Ryan nodded slowly. The simplicity of the answer struck him harder than any lecture could. The mission mattered. Not her reputation. Not her pride. Not proving anyone wrong. The mission. Later that morning, Captain Harper gathered several soldiers before they departed for future assignments. He thanked the team for their professionalism and adaptability. Then he paused. His eyes moved briefly toward Sarah. The strongest people in this profession are not always the loudest, he said. Sometimes they are the ones who keep doing the right thing while everyone else is still making up their minds. The group fell silent. Nobody needed him to explain further. Across the compound, Sarah lifted her rifle case into the transport vehicle and prepared to leave. The same soldiers who had once laughed now watched with genuine respect. Not because she demanded it. Not because she announced who she was. Because she had earned it the hardest way possible. Through discipline. Through competence. Through action. And as the vehicle pulled away from the base, Ryan found himself looking toward the distant ridgeline one last time. The mountain had never changed. The mission had never changed. The only thing that had changed was how they saw the woman who had quietly stood her ground when it mattered most.